In the first 4 months of 1997, flooding throughout the Midwest caused hundreds of millions of dollars in damage and displaced thousands of residents and businesses. In the northern Kentucky community of Falmouth, 12 inches of rain fell in 24 hours early in March, causing the Licking River to overrun its banks and sweep across the town. The flood literally immobilized residents, cutting off electricity and phone service, and forcing 2,400 people to evacuate their homes.
About 11 o'clock, the water started coming in, and they were calling for us to evacuate, and by then it was almost too late. We got caught in the flood. We broke into a house and went up to the second floor of the house and waited to be rescued.
In terms of the flooding within the city of Falmouth, it is very unique in that in prior flood events across the country, which involve more of an immersion type of flooding with water backing into the town, the North Fork of the Licking River actually rose out of its banks, cut directly across town at a height exceeding the roof line of some single-story dwellings. It rose very fast, it caught the town off guard, and ultimately washed many dwellings, structures, trees, anything that could float away or become buoyant was washed downstream.
Days later, when the waters finally receded, what was left in the flood's wake was a wasteland of debris. Homes, possessions, and property all needed to be inventoried, evaluated, and cleaned up. As part of that cleanup effort, an EPA team was dispatched to Falmouth.
EPA became involved in the flood response after the state of Kentucky requested assistance through FEMA with the collection, recovery, and ultimate disposal of orphan drums, tanks, and containers that were washed away by the floodwaters.
Normally, when EPA responds to a drum cleanup job, the approach is relatively straightforward. But the dynamic nature of this flood called for some new ideas.
Here you have to do a lot of logistical planning as you evolve through the process of the response, like how to get to certain areas that have been isolated by the flood by waters and high debris piles. So we're having to basically work our way through some logistics here to try and get to these areas.
We have a road crew in Falmouth and in Butler picking up orphan drums and containers from residential yards and other floodplain areas, and we have a very large crew here just downstream of Falmouth on Monroe's Island picking up more of the larger underground storage tanks, propane tanks, and other containers. This material is commingled with debris, a large portion of it being building material that was washed away from the flood, and we're staging it, and we're going to make preparations to move it out of this area and ultimately dispose of it.
A canine unit was also called in to help search through the debris. At the time, 45 residents still remained unaccounted for, making the potential of uncovering a victim an unfortunate reality. While the land-based crew cleaned up materials that had washed across the floodplain, another EPA team combed the banks of the Licking and Ohio rivers on a barge system, specifically assembled to safely locate, collect, and transport hazardous materials. Typically, a team onshore scoured the banks for orphan drums and containers while the barges drifted alongside. When a drum was discovered, the barge system anchored while the shore team moved the drums to an accessible point. A drum basket attached to a crane on one of the barges was then swung around and lowered to the shore. The drums were loaded into the basket, then hoisted to a hopper barge, where another team staged the materials. To categorize hazardous products, a special quick kit was used. The instrument's color-coded results allowed workers to immediately identify products prior to staging.
You look at this as not quite as unknown drums like as digging up drums on a hazardous waste site. Most of the drums in this area come from petroleum storage facilities or garages that are mostly dealing with automobiles, so you're dealing with basically oils.
Many of the containers being recovered by both the land and water teams were large underground fuel storage tanks that were sucked above ground by the floodwaters.
Probably one of the more unique things that we've observed is just the force or the power behind a rapidly rising river. As you can see with some of the underground storage tanks, these were in place below ground at a facility. They did contain petroleum products and fuel, but yet they're still buoyant enough to be forced from the ground and floated downstream.
To recover these high-capacity tanks from the river utilizing the barges, the team varied the retrieval process, which permitted the tank's contents to be transferred safely.
Today we recovered a 4,000-gallon underground storage tank that was displaced. Had an open manhole, so we had a technician do a HazCat test on it, and we found that it was contaminated with petroleum. So we didn't want to spill the petroleum back in the water, so we took a vac system here on board, sucked out about 100 gallons into a tanker truck compartment, emptied the container, and then lifted the container in the hopper barge.
The drums, containers, and tanks from both remediation teams were then taken to a Kentucky Department of Transportation yard for final categorization, segregation, and disposal.
At that location, they will be separated into a number of groups, one group being propane tanks and home heating oil tanks. We do hope to return those to the companies or the vendors that they originated from, and other tanks and containers of material that we cannot find the proper ownership, we will arrange for disposal of that material.
We've got drums here and drums down through there.
EPA's work in Falmouth helped one community tackle a job that at times seemed hopeless.